We're going to dive into the dark side of chocolate, the heavy metal side. So there was a new study that was just dropped on July 31st. Here it is. And it is starting to shake up the chocolate world. So, Joel, just picture this. You're curled up on the couch after having a long day of work, and you get your single little square of dark chocolate, right? You're going to savor it because you feel pretty good about that, because dark chocolate is supposed to be healthy. It's supposed to help with heart health, cognitive function, and it tastes great. But what if that virtuous indulgence was hiding a little secret? So researchers from the George Washington University and consumerlab.com decided to kind of peek behind the wrapper of 72 popular dark chocolate and cocoa products. And what they found might make you think twice before reaching for the next piece of chocolate, or shall I say lead and cadmium. Those are two of the heavy metals that you don't want in your diet, let alone your chocolate. But it appears to be present in chocolate at higher levels than some of us previously thought. So first, I want to start with this, though. What makes this study so special? Because we've had previous reports of heavy metals in chocolate. So Consumer Reports has published on this, As You Sow has published on this, but those were like a snapshot in time. So basically what that means is they would get chocolate bars, for instance, from the grocery store, send it to a lab, have it tested, and report on the findings. And some of them did show high levels of lead and cadmium. This study is different because it's not a snapshot. They actually looked at products over an 8-year time period. So from 2014 to 2022. So it's kind of like a chocolate time capsule. Okay. This had never been done before, according to the lead researchers. And they tested popular brands that you would find in a common grocery store or online. So things like Ghirardelli, Hu, which Hu's become a popular brand for, a lot of health enthusiasts. Lily's, the Whole Foods 365 brand, Nestle, Now Real Foods, Baker's, Good and Gather, among others. So what they did was they tested these for heavy metals over a time period, and the first thing that showed up was lead. Lead, that stuff that we banned from paint and from gasoline because it's just not good for our health. Well, 43% of all of the products that they tested exceeded the California Prop 65 limit for lead. So 43% of them had too much lead in them, according to Prop 65. Now, according to the FDA's guidelines for how much heavy metal can be in a product, 97% of them were still below the FDA's guideline. So I wonder.
California's clearly got a higher or a lower limit. They've got a different threshold.
They clearly have a different threshold. And for me, I definitely gear toward the Prop 65 limit for lead, not the FDA's guideline. Not only historically speaking of, how we know the FDA creates its guidelines, but for the stricter standard, because if you look in the literature, there's one scientific journal after the next that is showing that there is no safe level of lead in the blood.
Yeah, that's what I was going to. Lead is cumulative, and from what I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, you're not supposed to get any lead. I mean, lead at pretty much at any level is unacceptable. So why? I'll let you go ahead and tell the story, but I'm desperate about why do they have to put it in there?
Yes. So let's get into that. First, let me tell you the summation of the results, and then I want to dive right into that as well. Okay. So one thing I want to point about lead, because some people listening or watching us may just think, oh, you're being extremists, like lead can't be that bad, right? But even low levels can be toxic to the central nervous system, like contributing to cognitive decline, fine motor control issues, attention deficit disorder. I mean, think of all the issues we're having with kids now with attention deficit. And these findings are occurring in both kids and adults. There was a 2022 review in a journal called Systematic Reviews, and they found that lead exposure can lower the IQ score of children They're saying it's potentially irreversible, which, I don't believe in that. But either way, this isn't exactly the brain boost that we think we're getting from the chocolate, right? It's kind of doing the opposite if it does have higher levels of lead. And then they showed higher levels of cadmium. Now, cadmium is not as famous as lead, of course, but it is no less concerning. 35% of the products exceeded Prop 65 limits for cadmium. Okay, there's actually a review that I found in Current Atherosclerosis Report. They actually are calling cadmium a, quote, cardiovascular risk factor. They're saying cadmium promotes the progression of atherosclerosis, so it is determined to be now a risk factor. It can also increase blood pressure and increase your risk of kidney damage. And a review in 2016 said that it might actually increase your risk for fractures. Okay, and now here is one of the most startling findings of this study, which is why I started out by saying health enthusiasts need to hear this episode, because the organic chocolate had higher levels of both lead and cadmium, right, compared to their conventional counterparts. So talk about a plot twist. It's like the organic products were 280% more likely to exceed the Prop 65 cadmium limit, and they were 14% more likely to exceed its lead limit. All right, that's crazy, right? Because we're reaching for that dark chocolate. We're making sure it's organic. Some of us are making sure it's like non-GMO certified and fair trade certified. And they actually found that even those certifications meant nothing in terms of lower levels of heavy metals. Okay, so it didn't matter. And in organic, it was worse. So I actually had the opportunity to talk with one of the lead researchers, Dr. Lee Frame. She was one of the lead researchers of this particular study. And she actually told me that their hypothesis was that the organic products would be lower in heavy metals. And that's because they theorized that they didn't have the fertilizers and the pesticides on those crops, those cocoa bean crops. And they thought that those fertilizers and pesticides were what was bringing in heavy metals to the chocolate products. But she said to me that what they found was, quote, exactly the opposite. Now, why these organic products have higher levels of heavy metal, she said, is unclear. She said a couple things. One is perhaps fertilizers and pesticides are not adding as many heavy metals to this crop as they previously thought. But she also thinks that, part of the introduction of the heavy metals comes from the processing of these beans. So what she is theorizing is that the manufacturers who are processing the organic products, they may not be as aggressive in like scrubbing them and using like high heat and stuff to process them. And so maybe the gentler processing methods themselves are leaving more residual heavy metals in that final product. It's kind of like the chocolate equivalent of not washing your vegetables, right? So, but again, she emphasizes this is her theory. She doesn't know. So let's dive a little deeper into what you asked about. Where are these heavy metals coming from? There's a couple places that we have identified. One is starting from the original source, the soil, where the cocoa trees are grown. The cocoa trees apparently are really good at absorbing heavy metals from the soil, just kind of like rice, right? Rice is really good at absorbing the heavy metals. So these metals, some of them are occurring naturally in the soil, but they feel like quite a bit of them are from environmental contamination of the soil. Things like livestock manure that had heavy metals in it, polluted irrigation water, sewage sludge, which you and I have talked about on this program before, all the different toxins that are in sewage sludge. The government has acknowledged that there are heavy metals that show up consistently in sewage sludge. Pesticides, herbicides could also contribute to heavy metals in the soil, and even air pollution. Like when they it was worse in the past, she said, but there used to be these industrial plants that were set up right next to these cocoa bean fields. And so when they when they had these emissions coming from these industrial factories, that would go into the air and it would settle down onto the soil. So it's less of a problem today, but she does still think there's residuals. Okay. So the contamination doesn't stop there though. Here's an example of after harvest, how the cocoa beans could be contaminated, particularly with lead, because they think the cadmium exposure likely occurs in the soil. The lead exposure predominantly, she believes, occurs in the processing. Some would occur through soil exposure because there's still, for instance, lead in soil from when we had lead that was in gasoline. Okay. But what happens is after they've harvested the beans, these cocoa beans are usually dried in the sun for several days. And during that drying process, they can pick up lead from dust and dirt that's in the environment. And that it could also come from, like I said, the industrial pollution and the residuals in the soil. But as the beans dry, that dust that contains the lead adheres to the surface of the bean. Okay. And so then it gets processed into the chocolate. And here comes her theory about, well, if they're not scrubbing the beans thoroughly, then it's more likely to end up in the chocolate. So we think it's predominantly coming from those two sources, both the soil and the way that it's actually processed. All right.
No, that's such a fascinating just idea, because generally in you think in organics, you want to take a gentler approach to just about everything. I mean, that's kind of our philosophy, right? We take a gentler approach in all of its ramifications. And so here you have here you have the organic standards not not compensating for a gentler approach to how to handle something that has exposure to toxicity, but the standards don't address that issue, and so then it comes through.
That's
fascinating.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. When I wrote my first book, I actually reached out and was trying to get quotes from people. I didn't know anybody at the time, so it was like a miracle when somebody respond back and give me a quote that I could add to the book, right? So I reached out to Mike Adams, the health ranger, and he had just released a book on toxins in the environment. And he has his own lab that he created because there's so many toxins in the food supply, and he wanted to have a third party test these products. So anyhow, he responded back to me because I asked him, what is the most surprising thing that you've learned about our food supply? And I kid you not, he said to me, it's that even though we have large contamination of heavy metals across the food supply, there is no limit established for the organic label. So the organic label just ignored this problem altogether.
Friends, want to dive deeper into our thought-provoking conversations? Become part of the Beyond Labels family today by joining below. For any gift amount, you'll get access to the full, uncut episodes.